The journey began in a chaotic and clamorous world where silence was a rarity and the air hung thick with demands. Everywhere Elias looked, there was a relentless barrage of messages, a cacophony of voices all vying for attention and obedience. From the moment of waking, the pressure mounted. The morning radio commanded him to buy this soft drink. The television insisted he eat that specific breakfast cereal. Posters on his commute screamed for him to cast a vote for Mrs. Bloggs, to avoid this danger, or to embrace that cause. The landscape itself was cluttered with billboards and screens, each one shouting a directive. They told him to save the economy, to fear the aliens, to condemn the meat-eaters, or to support the capitalists. It was a dizzying marketplace of ideas and commands where acceptance or rejection often happened in the blink of an eye, driven by impulse rather than thought. In this initial state of unreflective existence, Elias moved through the noise, sometimes ignoring it, sometimes absorbing it, but rarely pausing to challenge the fundamental nature of the assault. The inciting incident occurred not with a shout, but with a question that cut through the din. Why? This single syllable marked the awakening of the critical thinker within him. It was the moment Elias stopped drifting and planted his feet, demanding a justification for the actions and beliefs being thrust upon him. He stood in the grocery aisle, paralyzed by a simple choice. Why should one choose the nutritious, sugar-free, low-fat cereal over the one marketed with images of attractive people smiling over bright red strawberries? The realization struck him that there was a profound difference between being manipulated by a sleek image and being persuaded by a good reason. Elias sought liberation from the tyranny of blind acceptance, understanding that to live an unexamined life, as a famous ancient philosopher once warned, is to live a life of discontentment and bad decisions. The goal became clear. He had to navigate this treacherous terrain by learning to identify and evaluate arguments, transforming from a passive vessel of propaganda into an active seeker of truth. However, the path to clarity was not straightforward. Elias quickly discovered that the word argument itself was misunderstood by the masses, who mistook it for a shouting match or a domestic squabble. True argumentation, he learned, was a constructive offering of reasons, a rational attempt to support a claim. It was distinct from the mere pressure of a threat or the seduction of a bribe, though these two offered reasons of a cruder sort. The journey required distinguishing the genuine argument from the impostor. Elias encountered scenarios that blurred the lines. He watched a television broadcast showing a shot of dead fish in a dirty pond accompanied by a demand for stricter laws, and he learned to see the implicit premises hiding behind the emotional imagery. As Elias attempted to map this new world, he encountered the first major obstacle, which was the deceptive nature of language itself. The tools of communication were slippery. A sentence that seemed to state a fact might be laden with rhetorical force, painting a picture that manipulated emotions rather than informing the intellect. He observed how a simple fact about a parent raising a child alone could be twisted by the label single mom, a term carrying political and emotional baggage that obscured the reality. He learned to listen for the unsaid, the implicature that hung in the air when a lecturer damned a student with faint praise, or when a politician suggested a burden without explicitly stating it. The terrain grew more difficult as he faced the twin fogs of ambiguity and vagueness. Words shifted and changed their meaning like chameleons. A headline about a stolen car found by tree momentarily confused him. Was the car found near the tree, or was the tree the finder? A promise of a big pay rise turned to dust when the vague term big was revealed to mean mere pennies. These linguistic traps were everywhere, laid by those who wished to hide the weakness of their positions behind a smokescreen of imprecise language. Elias learned to demand precision, to strip away the secondary connotations that gave words their emotional punch, like the difference between calling someone a terrorist versus a freedom fighter, and to rewrite these slippery sentences into clear, declarative propositions. The struggle intensified as he confronted the rhetorical ploys, the monsters of this narrative. These were non-argumentative devices designed to bypass reason entirely and strike directly at the heart or the ego. Elias withstood the appeal to novelty, rejecting the urge to buy the latest software simply because it was new. He resisted the appeal to popularity, understanding that just because a product is a bestseller does not mean it is the best. He steeled himself against the appeal to compassion, where images of suffering were used to open wallets without a rational link to the solution. He navigated the minefield of the appeal to fear, identifying the difference between a genuine warning about a biting dog and a politician's fabricated nightmare of impending doom designed to steal votes. In this phase of the journey, Elias also learned to recognize the smokescreen, a tactic used to change the subject and avoid scrutiny, and the straw man, where an opponent's view is distorted into a ridiculous caricature to be easily knocked down. He saw through the scare quotes that mocked legitimate ideas and the trading on equivocation where meanings were swapped midstream to deceive. It was a grueling gauntlet, requiring constant vigilance. To survive, Elias adopted a powerful method called Reconstruction. He began to take the messy, organic speech of everyday life and forge it into standard form. He learned to hunt for the conclusion, the destination of the persuasion, and the premises, the stepping stones leading there. He practiced identifying the indicator words like therefore and because, though he learned that these signposts were sometimes missing or misleading. Elias distinguished between the argument, which seeks to persuade of a truth, and the explanation, which merely accounts for a known fact. The leaking tap in his bathroom became a lesson. Stating the tap is leaking because of a worn washer is an explanation, whereas citing the sound of dripping water as proof the tap is leaking is an argument. This distinction became a crucial navigational tool. He also learned to spot extraneous material, the fluff and rhetoric that must be pared away to reveal the logical core. A letter complaining about the news media before discussing nuclear waste was dissected, the irrelevant complaints discarded to focus solely on the claims about uranium and plutonium. As Elias honed these skills, he reached a critical juncture. He could now strip an argument down to its bare bones, exposing the propositions and the inferences. He understood the importance of the principle of charity, the ethical and practical necessity of reconstructing an opponent's argument in its strongest possible form before critiquing it. This was not out of kindness, but to ensure that when he engaged, he was battling the best version of the truth, not a weak illusion. He learned that defeating a weak version of an argument proves nothing about the truth of the conclusion. The journey led him finally to the gates of logic, where the rules of engagement changed fundamentally. Here, Elias discovered the concept of truth in its most unadorned form, where a claim is true simply if things are as the claim states. But the major revelation, the turning point that altered his perception of the world forever, was the discovery of deductive validity. He realized that the power of an argument lies not just in the truth of its individual statements, but in the unbreakable iron link between them. He examined the logic of Janet Baker, observing how one can have true premises and a true conclusion and yet have a completely invalid argument, or false premises that logically necessitate a conclusion. This was the irreversible shift. Elias no longer looked merely at whether he agreed with a statement, but at whether the structure of the reasoning guaranteed it. He saw that an argument is a machine. If the machine is valid, and the fuel of premises is true, the product of the conclusion must be true. This concept of soundness became the gold standard. He learned to test this machine by imagining possible worlds, scenarios where the premises are true but the conclusion is false. If such a world can be imagined, the argument is broken. With the acquisition of this rigorous standard, Elias left behind the naive world of mere opinion and entered the realm of formal assessment, ready to test the structural integrity of every claim placed before him. Before we move on, please subscribe to our channel, Deep Thinker, and hit that like button if you enjoy self-improvement content. Also, don't forget to share this with your friends and family. Alright, let's get back to it. Equipped with the ironclad concept of deductive validity, Elias stepped into a more structured, yet paradoxically more complex realm known as the architecture of propositional logic. Here, the world was no longer a jumble of isolated sentences but a vast network of connections, governed by rigid laws that dictated how truths could be combined and manipulated. Elias learned that the power of an argument often resided not in the long, flowing prose of its content, but in the small, seemingly insignificant hinges that joined the parts. He focused on words like and, or, and if. These were the logical connectives, the gears of the reasoning machine that kept the structure from collapsing. Elias began to map this new territory by dissecting compound sentences. He discovered that a statement claiming two things at once, asserting that Paris is in France and Berlin is in Germany, was a fragile construct because it required both halves to be true to survive. If even one part failed, the entire conjunction collapsed into falsehood. This vulnerability stood in stark contrast to the disjunction, the realm of the word or. Here, Elias found a more forgiving structure. If told that logic is difficult or the textbook is heavy, he realized that only one side needed to hold true for the whole to stand. However, he also uncovered a trap in the ambiguity of the word or itself. He had to pause and determine if it meant one or the other, or possibly both. He learned to distinguish the inclusive sense, which welcomed both possibilities, from the exclusive sense, which forced a hard choice between two alternatives. The most powerful and dangerous tool in this arsenal was the conditional, the structure of if and then. It was a one-way street of logic that Elias had to navigate with extreme care. He learned to identify the antecedent, the spark that lights the fuse, and the consequent, the explosion that follows. He grasped the critical distinction between a sufficient condition, which was enough to guarantee an outcome, and a necessary condition, which was required but perhaps not enough on its own. Being a dog was sufficient to be an animal, he reasoned as he watched a stray trot down the alley, but being an animal was merely necessary to be a dog, for the cats and birds he saw shared that same broad tent. With these tools, Elias engaged in the practice of formal logic, translating the messy, organic language of the everyday into symbolic clarity. He replaced sentences with capital letters, P, Q, R, stripping away the distracting flesh of the words to reveal the skeletal structure beneath. In this abstract space, he encountered the truth table, a grid-like map that exhausted every possibility of the universe. By tracing the rows of true and false, he could see exactly under what conditions a complex argument held up or crumbled. He mastered the classic forms of valid reasoning. He utilized modus ponens, the forward thrust that affirms the antecedent to prove the consequent, and modus tollens, the defensive shield that denies the consequent to prove the antecedent was never true. But as Elias grew confident in this binary world of black and white certainties, he hit a wall. He emerged from the clean laboratory of deduction into the messy, unpredictable reality of the wider world. Here, he realized that not all good arguments guaranteed their conclusions with absolute mathematical certainty. He encountered the vast, gray domain of inductive force. This was the complication that raised the stakes. In real life, Elias realized as he stood on the platform, the train is late not because logic dictates it, but because it probably is based on past experience. He had to shift his mindset from searching for what must be true to assessing what is likely to be true. This transition introduced the concept of probability, a sliding scale of rational expectation. Elias learned that an argument could be inductively forceful if the premises, while not guaranteeing the conclusion, made it more probable than not. He grappled with the probability of the conclusion, understanding that if the premises are true, the conclusion might still be false, but it would be a surprise. He learned to quantify this surprise, differentiating between a plausible argument and a truly strong one. He discovered inductive soundness, a badge of honor for arguments that not only have valid structure but also true premises, yet he had to accept the inherent risk that even a sound inductive argument leaves room for error. As he ventured deeper into this probabilistic terrain, Elias faced the specific monsters of inductive reasoning. He encountered the challenge of generalization, where a single observation is stretched to cover a whole population. He learned to be wary of the sample and asked himself if it was large enough or representative. He saw the folly of judging the health of a nation by looking only at the patients in a single hospital ward. He fought the base rate fallacy, realizing that a rare disease's positive test result might still mean he was likely healthy if the disease was incredibly uncommon in the general population. The journey then took a darker turn as Elias entered the forest of fallacies. These were the twisted reflections of good reasoning, the deceptive mimics that trapped the unwary. Elias first confronted the formal fallacies, the evil twins of the valid forms he had mastered earlier. He spotted affirming the consequent, a seductive error that assumes because the streets are wet, it must have rained, ignoring the street cleaner who just passed by. He identified denying the antecedent, which falsely claims that if it didn't rain, the streets cannot be wet, again forgetting the other causes. Deeper in the forest, the informal fallacies lay in wait. These traps did not depend on the shape of the argument but on the content of the words. Elias was tempted by the slippery slope, where a small first step was claimed to lead inevitably to a catastrophic ruin, marijuana leading to heroin, leading to the collapse of society, without any evidence for the slide. He learned to stand firm and demand proof for each step of the descent. He encountered the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, the superstition that because B followed A must have caused B. He learned to distinguish correlation from causation, understanding that just because ice cream sales and shark attacks rise at the same time does not mean ice cream attracts sharks. He looked for the hidden third factor, which was the summer heat. The battles became personal. Elias faced the ad hominem, where the opponent attacked the speaker rather than the argument, calling them a hypocrite or a fool to distract from the truth of their claim. He learned that a smoker can still logically argue that smoking is bad for you because the truth of the proposition does not depend on the lungs of the speaker. He navigated the tu quoque, the childish defense of you do it too, which excused nothing. He dismantled the straw man, seeing how opponents built a weak, ridiculous version of a position just to burn it down and claim victory. He learned to spot the false dilemma, the trap that offered only two extreme choices like love it or leave it when a middle ground clearly existed. Elias also wrestled with begging the question, the circular trap where the conclusion is smuggled into the premises, proving nothing. He saw through the fallacy of majority belief, understanding that the fact that everyone believes the earth is flat does not make it so. He learned to scrutinize analogies, asking if the comparison between the national budget and a household budget truly held, or if the differences in the underlying mechanics made the comparison a faulty analogy. Through these trials, Elias refined his epistemic standards. He began to see that believing is not a passive state but an active responsibility. He encountered the concept of rational persuasiveness, realizing that an argument might be logically sound but fail to persuade if the audience does not accept the premises. This forced him to consider the burden of proof. He learned that the person making the remarkable claim, that ghosts exist, or that the accused is guilty, must shoulder the weight of evidence. As the second phase of his journey neared its end, Elias stood on a precipice. He had mastered the mechanical rules of deduction and navigated the probabilistic fogs of induction. He could spot a fallacy from a mile away and dismantle a rhetorical ploy with surgical precision. But a new, more profound crisis loomed. He realized that having the tools to assess arguments was not enough. He now had to grapple with the nature of the material itself. He had analyzed the forms of truth, but he had not yet confronted the definition of truth itself. He faced the dizzying question of whether truth is objective or relative, and how knowledge differs from a lucky guess. The tools of logic had cleared the brush, but they had revealed a vast, philosophical landscape that must be crossed to reach true understanding. Elias was no longer just a logic chopper. He was becoming a philosopher, ready to face the ultimate questions of what we can know and how we can justify our place in reality. Before we move on, please subscribe to our channel, Deep Thinker, and hit that like button if you enjoy self-improvement content. Also, don't forget to share this with your friends and family. Alright, let's get back to it. Elias stood at the threshold of the most elusive chamber in the Palace of Reason, which was the domain of truth itself. Having mastered the mechanical gears of deduction and navigated the shifting sands of probability, he now confronted the fundamental nature of the material he had been handling all along. The journey turned inward, challenging Elias to distinguish between the map in his mind and the territory of reality. He discovered that truth is not a democratic process. It is not determined by a show of hands or the intensity of a feeling. He embraced the rigorous definition that a proposition is true if and only if the world is as the proposition describes. This realist view became his anchor. He realized that believing something, no matter how passionately, does not make it true, and conversely, a fact remains a fact even if no one believes it. The distinction between it is true that and I believe that became a sharp blade in his hand, severing the ego from the equation. However, a shape-shifting adversary blocked the path. The relativist appeared as a seductive figure, whispering that there is no objective truth, only your truth and my truth. This figure claimed that reality is nothing more than a construct of culture, language, or individual perspective. Elias recognized this as the ultimate intellectual black hole, a place where no argument can survive because the very standard of correctness has been dissolved. To defeat this foe, Elias drew upon the weapon of self-refutation. He turned the relativist's own logic against them by asking if the statement all truth is relative is itself objectively true. The relativist was caught in a fatal paradox. If the statement is objectively true, then objective truth exists, and the claim is false. If the statement is only relatively true, then it is merely an opinion with no binding power over anyone else. The phantom dissolved, leaving Elias with the hard, undeniable responsibility of seeking objective reality, however difficult that search might be. With the fog of relativism cleared, Elias ascended to the citadel of knowledge. Here, he sought more than just correct answers. He sought the right to hold them. He learned that knowledge is a three-pillared structure, requiring belief, truth, and most crucially, justification. He understood that being right by accident is not knowledge. It is merely a lucky guess. He visualized a gambler who bets on a horse because of a dream and wins, realizing that the gambler does not know the horse would win but is merely the beneficiary of chance. To truly know, Elias realized he must possess justified true belief. He had to accept the burden of providing reasons, of building a bridge of evidence strong enough to support the weight of the claim. This realization transformed his understanding of opinion. No longer did he view all opinions as equal gems to be respected. He saw them as raw ore. Some were rich with the gold of justification, while others were mere gravel, baseless and disposable. The protective shield of everyone is entitled to their opinion was revealed to be a political courtesy, not an intellectual immunity. It granted the right to speak, not the right to be right. The climax of the journey arrived when Elias faced the extended argument. No longer dealing with isolated sentences or short paragraphs, he confronted a sprawling, complex text, an editorial, a political speech, or a philosophical treatise, where the logical structure was buried under layers of prose, repetition, and rhetoric. This was the final test of his skills. Elias engaged the principle of charity one last time, not out of weakness, but as a disciplined strategy to extract the strongest possible version of the opponent's case. He painstakingly stripped away the extraneous material, the jokes, the insults, and the wandering anecdotes, leaving only the bare bones of the reasoning. He identified the main conclusion, often hidden at the beginning or buried at the end, and traced the web of sub-arguments that supported it. He mapped the flow of inference, spotting where a premise in one chain served as the conclusion for another. In this decisive moment, Elias synthesized every tool he had acquired. He tested the skeleton for deductive validity, looking for the ironclad guarantee. If that failed, he tested for inductive force, weighing the probabilities. He scrutinized the premises for truth, demanding sources and evidence. He scanned for the lurid glare of fallacies, checking if the argument relied on a slippery slope, an ad hominem attack, or a straw man distortion. He listened for the subtle hum of rhetorical ploys, ensuring he was not being swayed by a scare quote or an appeal to novelty. It was a rigorous, exhausting process of reconstruction and evaluation. Elias realized that critical thinking is not a passive state of consumption but an active, creative act of reconstruction. He was no longer a spectator in the marketplace of ideas. He was an inspector, a judge, and a guardian of his own mind. The resolution brought a quiet transformation. Elias understood that the ultimate purpose of this journey was not to become a cynical destroyer of arguments, tearing down the beliefs of others for sport, but to achieve autonomy. He was now free from the tyranny of the loudest voice and the sleekest image. He could distinguish between a reason to believe a claim because it is likely true and a reason to act on a claim because it is beneficial or safe, avoiding the trap of wishful thinking where desire paints over reality. He accepted that certainty is rare and that most human knowledge deals in degrees of probability. This humility was his armor. He knew that he, too, was fallible, and he applied the same rigorous standards to his own beliefs as he did to others, constantly checking his own premises and logic. In the final denouement, Elias stood ready to engage with the world, not as a vessel to be filled with propaganda, but as an independent agent capable of reasoned judgment. The noise of the world, the advertisements, the political slogans, the pundits, had not ceased, but its power to manipulate has been broken. Elias saw the invisible wires of inference and the hidden structures of persuasion. He had moved from the confusion of the unexamined life to the clarity of the critical thinker, equipped to navigate the complexities of existence with the compass of logic and the lantern of justification. He understood that while truth may be difficult to find, the search for it is the only path to genuine understanding and intellectual freedom. The story ended with Elias fully awakened to the responsibilities of the rational mind, stepping forward into a complex world with the enduring capacity to think clearly, argue fairly, and choose wisely.